Okay, welcome everybody to this session on dyslexia and the construction of the reading brain. We are so excited to have two wonderful presenters here with us. Comer Yates is the executive director of the Atlanta Speech School, which is one of our Better Brains for Babies partners. And Sandra Knight Mims is a licensed speech language pathologist, and I'm going to let them do further introductions of themselves because they've got a lot of information they want to share. So please join me in welcoming them. And Comer and Sandra, we look forward to hearing what you've got to say. For those of you listening, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. We may answer a lot of the questions toward the end, but we will try to leave time to get to them. So Comer and Sandra, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Diane and everybody, thank y'all. We're looking forward to this hour. And I'm the executive director of the Speech School. I've been here 20 years, and my background is not in special education. I have a background in general ed and other things in my life. But Sandra is our chief academic officer and oversees all of our work that we'll describe in just a moment. So she is the person who brings the expertise and supports our 205 staff who are here at the Speech School. So quickly, just looking beyond this first slide to the second slide, what we want to talk about is have a framework for the discussion today on dyslexia. And if you're talking about babies here, when we talk about Better Brains for Babies, we can start with the fact that just remember that language nutrition for all babies is essential, and we'll talk in a minute about why it is essential. So the big thing, for some perspective on dyslexia, when at most the percentages are around 20% of children may have some version of dyslexia around challenges to read. The fact is that only 36% of our children in the country are proficient readers. And so the question becomes then, well, what in the world, how did Governor Deal and Mrs. Deal come up with a crazy idea that by 2020 that all Georgia children would be on this path to read proficiently by the end of third grade? Why would anybody think that that's reality? And the fact is, to understand Governor Deal and Mrs. Deal's commitment, and that of so many of the others of us who believe in this same promise to Georgia's children, is to understand a little bit about literacy and the framework for literacy first before we get into the specific challenge around dyslexia. And when I think about literacy, I think of it as a 577-year-old language disorder, because until 1440, when Gutenberg invented the printing press, nobody was required to read. We were involved in oral language. With the invention of the printing press, now suddenly people were required to read, but only a limited number of the population had that capacity. I can give the example that in 1440, when he invented the printing press, there were 30,000 books in Europe, and 50 years later, there were 12 million books in Europe. So in other words, our brains don't have a native circuit for reading. Reading doesn't just happen for any of us, even though most of us can't remember how we learned to read. It seems like it did, but in fact, that's not the case. We have an auditory and a visual circuit in our brain, and what happens to us, going back to this first point about language nutrition, from the last trimester of pregnancy through the first 8 years of life, and what the interactions with the adults in our lives look like during this basically 8-year period is going to determine whether we have acquired a reading brain within this period when the brain is most plastic and available for this kind of construction, and when neural pathways, when synapses can be formed. So while 36% of U.S. children read proficiently today, and that's an illiteracy crisis, that's more children than have ever read before, but it's still, again, way short of where children should be. And if you look at the next slide, you can see that this disorder really is impacting children And the vaccine that's available around what the research says can happen to break this cycle. This is a disorder that is impacting adversely children based on race and ethnicity and zip code, and shocking disparities is reflected here, with 46% of African white children reading proficiently and only 21%, and Hispanic children, 18% of African American children. And then you can see, of course, again, the gross disparities around children who are eligible for free and reduced lunch and those who aren't. And probably most of you have heard about the 30 million word gap and the differences in the number of words children have heard in the early years. But we are ones to emphasize that while data look at race and ethnicity and socioeconomic circumstances, really the research is around predictors of illiteracy come from whose family has had generational lack of access to educational opportunity, and who's been caught in that cycle such that what happens from birth to 5 really interferes with a child's ability to learn to read from kindergarten through 3rd grade. And in fact, in the South, if you look at these demographics, not only are we talking about children who have lacked access to educational opportunity for generations. With respect to African American children, there's of course a long history of education being denied to those children, in fact, for at least close to a 200-year period. So that's a framework, and then you can see how it plays out in the Atlanta area when you look at the scattergram on the left of socioeconomic wealth on the left-hand side, and how that matches up with literacy, wealth, and almost the perfect perfect overlay of those two. Again, who's had access to educational opportunity that affords socioeconomic success, who's had access to early language that allows them to compete in the marketplace, and who's had access to early language that they can pass on to their children, so their children have the kind of language foundation they need by which to become successful learners. So moving on from there, and again, we're welcome questions at any time. This goes back to Governor Deal and why he said that, why he and those of us who share and so appreciate his commitment to Georgia's children, the reason why we would say that we can have all our children on a trajectory to grade level reading is that nobody really understood how the brain needed to respond to Gutenberg's invention until the last 20 or 30 years, where the leading reading experts and brain researchers in the country have figured out what experiences a child has to have from the last trimester of pregnancy through age 8. And so here on this slide, you can see the things that have to happen birth to 5, kindergarten through 3rd grade, and then for the rest of life beyond, in order for this reading brain to be created for each child. And for us at the Speech School, our view is that without a reading brain, then a child's ability to decide his own future, impact the lives of others, becomes virtually impossible in an information-based economy. So Sandra, I don't know if you want to jump in on any of this slide and talk about this a bit.
Well, just to say that, and welcome everybody, just to say that this preparation of the reading brain during the last trimester to age 5, if you haven't had the opportunity to read Dr. Kuhl's work, it's really incredibly interesting how in years past, we have thought that, yes, it's important to get vocabulary into children and all of the empathy and affirmation builds self-concept. But what we now know through her work is that literally it's preparing the reading brain by how much language a child hears. That in that last trimester, a child is able to analyze the phonemes that are spoken by the parent and or others around them, and that analysis is sitting there waiting until we are ready to attach the phonemes and the analysis that goes with them to letters when they enter pre-K or kindergarten.
Can you talk, you're the master of talking about parent ease as an example of what that does for building those 44 sounds, the phonemes, how we naturally use parent ease with young children.
You know, I am a mother of 2 and a grandmother of 6, and there's just something about parent ease that rolls out of my mouth when I'm around one of my grandbabies. And I never really understood what that was about, but it seems that it's sort of a natural instinct, and for many, many people, and for other people who have not had that in their own lives, it isn't natural. But parent ease, given that a baby's brain is analyzing the sounds that it hears from its caregivers, parent ease actually elongates the vowels and makes the consonants even more crisp, so that that baby's brain is finds it easier to take those sounds in and do that analysis that will help attach those to the letters when we get to that point. For those of you who don't know what parent ease is, it really is that sort of cooing, lyrical sound that...
Oh, come on, give us an example.
Oh, you're so cute. Look at your little toes. And all of you are laughing, and I understand that, and it's okay. But somehow, when facing a baby, it all seems okay. It's not baby talk. It is grammatically accurate speech and language, but it is, as I said, it has this quality about it that makes it easier for the baby's brain to take it in. All of this construction of the reading brain, and the model that allows us to talk about this is really built around avoiding any sort of developmental issues with the development of language. While your brain is not, a baby's brain is not programmed for reading, it absolutely is programmed for language. And I think Dr. Kuhl's work points that out even more. In addition to being the chief academic officer here at the speech school, I also am the lower school director of our Wardlaw School, and Comer will talk a little bit about who we are as the speech school. But the Wardlaw School is a school for children who have language-based learning disabilities, including dyslexia. So if you look at it from our perspective, whenever we can build phonemic awareness, and we'll talk about that later too, from before birth, and that really is what we're doing when we're using parent ease and we're talking with our babies in utero and in those early days and years, we are helping to program that brain for reading. And in the cases of children who just have not had enough exposure, this is a benefit to them in a great, great way.
And so, if just going back to that slide, if we can, do we have the capacity to go back? If we don't, it's all right. No, we just went forward.
Sorry.
That's all right. One more back. Just if you look at that for a minute, again, around the illiteracy epidemic, what we've done, and again, Dana Susskind's book, who's a neurosurgeon, 30 Million Words, that explains the ravages of the language gap for families, again, caught in this cycle of lack of access to educational opportunity, about preparing the reading brain. What we've done often in the South as well, and around the country, with children. If you look again at the literacy rates for African American children, we've disrupted as a society this preparation of the reading brain because of the societal consequences and dangers that have existed in the South for so long. Parents have had to focus on their children's compliance and obedience because of the disproportionate, again, risk for children who are African American being non-compliant. There's a powerful study by Walter Gilliam on implicit bias in preschools. He's at Yale against African American boys. And the teachers who were most punitive and most identifying disruptive behavior by African American boys were African American teachers in the study because they were so concerned about keeping these boys safe. And by society forcing teachers and parents to focus and exalt on safety, we again have disrupted this neurological, natural relationship where parents are so powerful and unforgettable to their children. The children never forget a word they say or never even forget a sound they say. So, and then this regulation, hyperregulation of children also defeats the prefrontal cortex around developing executive function and self-regulation. That construction of the front part of the brain depends, as Dr. Kuhl says, as you see here, on children birth to 5 building up a history of good choices. So when they get to kindergarten and face novel choices, they have this bank to draw upon. But at birth to 5, if that preparation is missing, then you have a child without language in kindergarten who's communicating through behavior because he's been hyper-regulated. And now you get this toxic brew from kindergarten through 3rd grade where teachers haven't been trained, don't understand the birth to 5 science, and they are focused on code-based skills, having children learn how to decode, and they're worried about behavior management. They're telling the children to be quiet instead of asking the children to listen. They're, again, further defeating the prefrontal cortex, continuing to defeat children's acquisition of vocabulary because the brain is shutting down to make sure it's never wrong. And then, again, by the time you get to 3rd grade and beyond, then the ability to expand the reading brain, you've really built a house on quicksand because you turn children into decoders without the language foundation and executive function foundation. So that's how we think about, this is how, and the research is unequivocal on what we need to do to stop doing what we're doing, but we just have, and that's what Governor Deal and others are saying, let's apply this construction of the reading brain science. It's there, it's like a vaccine, but it's being distributed again based on factors that shouldn't be factors. So that's our work at the speech school. If you go to the next slide, as we turn to dyslexia. So for 80 years, we have focused on children who are in crisis for literacy acquisition. And we do that through our 4 schools and our 5 clinics with about 1,400 children being served through those programs. And we're focused on what does the science say about what we need to do to help each child who arrives at our door facing the challenge of acquisition of literacy ability or in crisis for it. What has to happen to that child? What do our behaviors need to be as adults? And then beyond that, we take this research that's available to us through our partner researchers around the country at Yale and Harvard and Georgia State and the University of Georgia. This isn't our research you're going to hear about. None of it is ours. All we've done is apply this unequivocal research around construction of the reading brain. And here we share that research through our Rollins Center and our online Cox campus. It's free and universally accessible for teachers of children birth to age 8 on who they need to be as a teacher in their classroom to ensure that construction for each child there. And so we have 21,000 teachers in our state and every state and about 24 other countries taking our courses. So our work is around being the educational equivalent of a teaching hospital, with our real strength being around dyslexia, among other strengths. because in 1975, our chief academic officer went to Northwestern along with 5 other people to get her PhD around language disorders. And this group of researchers in 1975 really discovered the dyslexic brain and what was happening to make the dyslexic brain not function as a reading brain. Dyslexia had been thought of until that time as a visually based disorder. This group of researchers recognized it really for the first time as a language-based disorder. Dr. Blaylock, Jane Blaylock, returned to our school, and for the rest of the end of the 20th century, she was applying this research to which she had singular access and getting singular outcomes with our dyslexic children. And so we're on this webinar today because of that research, again, that this group of people discovered and has been further developed over the last years, with which we've applied to influence and really change brain dynamics for children who are dyslexic and turn dyslexic brains into reading brains. So that's our work.
If I could give you just a little bit of an overview of the Wardlaw School and how we work with children with dyslexia before we move into a little bit more specific information about dyslexia generally. The length of stay in the Wardlaw School for a child is about 3 years. Children can come in at kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. We actually go through 6th grade. But a third of our school leaves every year and goes back to mainstream educational settings, typically accelerated. But because of the structure of the school and the specificity with which we attack the dyslexia component in their learning profile, children are able to go from non-readers to proficient readers and more sophisticated learners when they leave us. And so we would love to have anyone come and visit, see our classrooms. All of our teachers have master's degrees or above. It is a unique learning environment. I've been here for 31 years. I can't imagine teaching anywhere else.
We got to say that we opened as a free school 80 years ago, and we've never turned away a child because of a family's financial limitations. We believe in the social justice of every child having a voice, and that again means deciding his or her own destiny, and you've got to be able to read proficiently to do that. As Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you're forever free. So Sandra, can you talk about how we help children who are dyslexic become forever free?
I hope so. Everyone pretty much has seen Hollis Scarborough's wonderful reading rope, and we absolutely agree with the complexity of the development of literacy. And this is such a wonderful visual of how the individual structures or language abilities, as well as the skills that are being taught in school for a child, are interwoven, and they must all come together in this nice, tight, fluent execution in order for a reader to be a good reader. We now know that phonological awareness should actually, and this is Patricia Kuhl's work, should actually develop prior to the reading, the education for reading or literacy. It is something that should develop in the brain as a language ability rather than a reading skill. Now, it does double duty, of course. It is a reading skill that must be applied in order for phonics to actually happen and the act of decoding. But I think it's a wonderful visual for helping parents even understand how complex reading is. When you are in a classroom with 20 or 25 children, you as the educator have to begin to make some decisions about how will I teach these children to read, and who looks at risk to me, and how should I approach each one so that their own learning profile is handled in the very best way possible. So one of the things that we look at in children, in even very young children, are some of these simple, really. One is word retrieval weaknesses. I am a speech language pathologist, and years and years ago, I probably wouldn't have realized the significance of a word retrieval difficulty in a young child. We see children through our clinic, and it is my challenge to each of our therapists there to be cognizant of what this could tell us about a child going forward as a reader. Word retrieval very frequently relates into difficulty with rapid naming, and because it is from an area of the brain where information must be pulled very quickly, all this language information. But rapid naming of objects and colors, digits, letters, it requires that the retrieval system for a child be as robust as possible. A critical skill for reading. Even if phonemic awareness has developed pretty well, and in many of our children who are dyslexic, it has simply because of the processing that the brain is going through. But it is critical that a child be able to retrieve that information quickly in order for us to teach a child.
Well, I see that you don't have letter reversals up here as a warning sign.
Yes, you are a plant. So I don't have letter reversals up here, even though, of course, we see letter reversals in children. I would say that in years past, we did not use the dyslexia.
Sandra, I hate to interrupt you. It's Diane. Your sound is kind of going in and out. I don't know if there's something different you all can get closer to a microphone.
Now, when did that start, Diane?
Minute or two ago.
Huh. Yeah, we haven't done anything differently. Is this any better?
It's a little fuzzy. I'd say go ahead. Sorry, I hate to interrupt.
If we move closer, let's see if that will help.
Is that any better, Diane?
Still a little fuzzy, but I'd say go ahead and let's see if it resolves itself.
All right. Sorry, let's be sure we're not on any boards or anything.
Hang on, we don't just check on one thing first. What is that noise?
Hang on, Diane.
That's fine.
Wow, that's really nice. All right, let's see. Is that any better?
Still a little fuzzy. I can understand you a little better. I'd say go ahead.
Okay. Okay. All right. So the rapid naming is critical.
So going back to the letter reversal.
Oh, the letter reversal. When community felt as if and that dyslexia was merely a visual issue. Letters were reversed, and that was the symptomatology that you looked for dyslexia. We did not use the dyslexia at that time because, as Palmer mentioned, our chief academic officer, as a speech language pathologist, felt so strong
I hate to interrupt you all again.
That's what
The sound is actually getting worse. Can you all try calling in by phone? If you click in the upper left, there's a use your phone for audio button that'll give you a phone number to call in.
All right, hang on.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt you in the middle, but people really can't understand.
It doesn't.
So, and if you can barely hear me now, maybe if people do have questions while we're pausing.
That's a great idea. If anybody's got questions about what they've covered so far, if anybody wants to type things in the chat, feel free to do that. We're working on the sound. Incidentally, for any of the rest of you, if you're having sound issues that don't seem to be affecting anybody else, feel free to do the same thing. You can click that tab at the top and it'll give you a phone number to call in.
Can you hear us now?
We sure can. That's way better.
Is that better?
Way better. Fantastic.
All right,
I'd say go ahead.
Pressing ahead with quickly, because we've gotten behind me, on my question about the letter reversal, because I think I get more calls than parents that, run into my kids, my 5-year-old's reversing letters. Should we put him on a stretcher and get him to speech school?
And, when we think about that, we just realize that it can be developmental in so many children, and it can be a part of a dyslexic profile, but it is absolutely not what we look for as a warning for dyslexia. So
I think the one thing that Sandra has here that we also see for those of you working with young children like 3- and 4-year-olds with articulation errors, and they'll be sent to a speech language pathologist who will work on like tongue placement or whatever else it is, the sort of the oral motor fix for the articulation issue, and then claim that think that everything is fine. And then at age 7, we get too many of these children who are 8 or 9 who are showing up at our door who actually the dyslexia was missed, and particularly the articulation issue, going back to what is the product of sort of like the voices you heard a few minutes ago when the sound weren't working well. It was the way the brain was processing language demonstrated itself in the articulation error that was fixed for the moment with the mechanics of speech language. But of course, as language becomes more complex, that imprecise language sorting by the brain is going to reveal itself, and we've lost a couple of 3 years or maybe 20 years if people aren't attuned to that. Keep the file open.
And it actually ends up fixing, if you will, one of the main symptoms of an impending dyslexia.
Or masking, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
If a child experiences word retrieval difficulties in on-demand language, that's something to keep your eye on as an educator or as a parent. If phonemic awareness is weaker than expected, if you've begun to try to teach that in to your young children, and as Comer said, if there's an articulation issue, if a child, when they're beginning to decode, must decode the same word over and over when it may be separated by only 2 sentences, then that is something that you need to be concerned about.
Yeah, we get that now. The child's reading the storybook with the dad, and the dad will point to a word, and then it'll appear on the next page. And son, put on your thinking cap. We just had that you know, in sort of an exasperated way, and of course you're just doing brutal harm there. As Sandra says, now the child is disappointing the person he least wants to disappoint, but that's his child just cannot store that information or can't access the information.
Exactly. If fluency or automaticity with really any language component is something to really look at as potentially heralding a dyslexic concern. If a child is an outlier in his reading group, if you were teaching him reading, and that's not changing for you, that's a worry. The thing that I would say is the most worrisome to me, maddening, in either a public or private setting, is when the school is considering retaining the child because of reading performance. The thought that the do-over, if you will change things for a dyslexic child is illogical. And if a child is reluctant to read in your classroom. Now, what is dyslexia? As Comer said earlier, 5 to 20% of the population has some symptom of dyslexia. And so you're going to have quite a few of those if you are a classroom teacher or a reading teacher. You're going to be faced with quite a few of those children. Dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. It's not only about decoding. It is a language-based, meaning that the foundation of dyslexia is language. And it's neurobiological in origin. The brain processes information differently. And we know what it's characterized by, inaccuracy or a lack of fluency with word recognition. Obviously, there's poor spelling involved, but the actual anatomical studies are very clear in that the dyslexic child processes differently than the child who has had a lack of exposure or inadequate teaching. So you're going to have, however, in a classroom, this 5 to 20% of your students who are dyslexic, but you will also have a group of children likely who come from this generational lack of access to language, therefore an inadequately prepared reading brain. And while these children will process things differently, they both must be taught explicitly how to read. So when you look at the dyslexic brain, the dyslexic reader processes information much less efficiently. But that can change with the right intervention, and then the dyslexic reader becomes a capable, even an excellent reader. And the children who leave us after 3 years because of the emphasis that is placed on the development of the reading brain, the preparation as well as the instruction can be in place, and children can move on with much less difficulty.
So if somebody said, so if a child who's dyslexic, true or false, good instruction can rewire the child's brain?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that never would have been said, 10 years ago?
Probably more like 15.
Yeah.
Because, the research has been coming online for some time now. But there are still misconceptions about dyslexia. It is a language-based learning disability. It is neurobiological, so it requires very specific instruction in order to further develop the understanding of the letters or the orthography of our language and the phonology and the sounds, and be able to put those together along with the rules that go along with our language. Rapid retrieval, again, is a marker. It manifests itself first in very young children in word retrieval. And that is something that in our pre-Ks and Ks we often overlook. And so I really want people to understand that whenever you see that, it is worth investigating. It is often inherited, and it can be improved in a home where language is rich and enriched regularly. You can see what it's not. It is.
Plus, it can also be impacted adversely at home when parents are trying to be their child's teacher and are using trial and error and just defeating the child's ability to develop.
Absolutely. Children do not outgrow dyslexia. It is something that requires specialized instruction, often over a period of years. It does not respond to whole class instruction in reading, and it is not beneficial for children to be asked to, rather than learn to decode, to memorize, simply because decoding is more difficult. So while we've talked about the preparation of the reading brain in a typically developing child, we must sort of help to rewire, as Comer said, the reading brain of a dyslexic child into a true reading brain. We use the term ecosystem here because we use language for all of our children. We don't tell our children to be quiet. We actually ask them, if we need their attention, we just ask them to listen, trying to help them develop some of their own executive functions around knowing how to handle themselves in situations. We will ask them how they can show respect as they are walking down the hall. But the reality is that language is so valued in these walls that we want children to talk as much as possible. In order to teach the dyslexic brain, you must present explicit systematic instruction in phonemic awareness, phonics, all of the people call it the Big Five now from the National Reading Panel. And these are, in our reading groups here, all 5 of the components identified by the National Reading Panel are presented every day in every reading group, but they are weighted based on the needs of the child and where they are in their journey towards having a robust reading brain. This to just sort of give you an idea of how we view, from a language perspective, a language-based learning disability perspective, really what dyslexia is. So many people say dyslexia means that a child has difficulty decoding or with phonics. And yet again, to me, that is another symptom of dyslexia, but you can't only deal with that symptom for a child and have that child be as successful as he should be. We are an oral to written to oral school. Because children struggle sometimes to retrieve, we work with them on the organization of their oral language and provide strategies, even as young as in kindergarten, for show and tell in how they might present orally, so that they aren't trying to memorize things. Memory is not always helpful to a child who has difficulty with oral expression in terms of retrieval. Once a little bit of anxiety enters the picture, and that can happen with just standing up in front of your class, retrieval becomes even more difficult. So we approach all of our learners from the perspective of what is underneath the surface, what isn't as linked in some people's eyes to dyslexia, because those things are menacing to children. And Marianne Wolf is so good to help us sort of understand how phonology, orthography, syntax, semantics, and morphology, going from the phoneme, the smallest unit of sound, to word parts, and how those have to all be attached to the symbols of our language, and then how they have to be ordered and put together so that they are understandable with the nuances of syntax. But there are other aspects of dyslexia that are just below the surface that not everyone is aware of.
Yeah, and maybe just jump in. Oh, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just to sort of show how many things actually lie beneath the surface for the dyslexic reader. And while many schools deal with the and specialists deal with the decoding, and there are, the programs, Orton Gillingham, Wilson, Spire, Lips, and others who have been proven to address the decoding component of dyslexia. These other components can impact the fluency that a child needs in order to be a great comprehender.
And that great comprehension is absolutely essential for the top of the language food chain, which is written expression, written language, where you've got to put all this together. And so what we see way too often right now, and there are a lot of schools who are working on programs that measure a child's development of a reading brain, basically hyper-focusing again on one element of that, which is the decoding ability, and a child can learn to decode simple words that are necessary for first and second grade. And so essentially with that focus, you picture shearing off the top of this iceberg so a child can navigate over the submerged part of the iceberg in a little in a kayak that has no depth to it, but get him on to 4th, 5th, 6th grade where this high-ordered thinking and complex language has to be merged with reading skills, and then picture the person writing an essay in college, and now I'm not steering with a kayak, but I've got to navigate with a big ship, maybe called the Titanic, and that submerged part of the iceberg is going to prevent that. It's going to make it look like the dyslexia has reappeared, but when in fact we never address the underlying problem. And we see a real epidemic at our school right now. We are seeing way too many children applying to our Wardlaw School in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, coming from schools where reading was defined as decoding and not addressing all these other things that created the strong foundation that's necessary. So anyway, we realize we've got about 5 minutes before we start answering y'all's questions.
Just to give you an overview of how we sort of look at the intervention for a child who's dyslexic. Often professionals find themselves working in silos, each attempting to guide the child's development of the reading brain, and we're all doing our own thing, and everyone is doing what he knows to be the best thing for that child. But when that occurs, sometimes a child can be a little more fragmented. I know as a speech-language pathologist, we are guilty of, quote, unquote, remediating the symptom. So we look at this as a really collaborative event where all of us, and you can see the players, work towards the child's development. I'm sure you've all heard of the National Reading Panel. It did identify what it takes for a good reader to be a good reader. It did not specifically address what a dyslexic brain needs, except it did look at, and not as robustly as it did these other components, but it did look at interventions and what needs to be done for children. Phonemic awareness, phonics, and decoding, fluency, and fluency is something that sort of gets left out until the very end, but I purposely put fluency in the middle because it needs to be trained from the very beginning. If a child is only reading at CBCs, that child can work on fluency in a book that is filled with CBCs. Vocabulary and comprehension is something that should be going on at all times as well. We view, as many others do, reading as the mapping of language onto symbols. And so obviously you must have an understanding of language in order to do that, and rapid recall of the symbol, which takes us back to the rapid naming component, for a child to be able to decode rapidly. Phonemes being the smallest unit of sounds, and phonemic awareness actually dealing with those small unit of sound in spoken words. Phonological awareness being a little more the word parts and sentences, and phonics then linking the phoneme with the symbol or the letter. So there really is, the difference obviously is that phonemic awareness really you could do with your eyes closed. It doesn't typically involve the letters. However, you can involve letters. As soon as you do, it becomes phonics. And phonics instruction is equally as critical as phonemic awareness. You just have to have the ability to utilize that auditory channel in order to have the phonemes to attach. This is just one example of how we might work towards phonological awareness in a group. How many words do you hear in this sentence? That boy loves football. And then you might ask, show me the words you hear in the sentence. We use a lot of technology to help us. We also use just felt squares, whatever we need in order to teach our children. Younger children may actually just draw the dashes to help them have a placeholder for each of the words that they've heard. We do this kind of exercise with all of our kindergarten first, and in some cases second. We get some children who come into us at second who do not have phonemic awareness or phonological awareness. Say cowboy, cowboy. Now say cowboy, but don't say cow. And you give the child a placeholder. I'm going to run through this just very quickly. You can see what it is asking of a child. Having the placeholder, whether it's a felt square or an electronic or technological something for the child to do, does help anchor it for him or her. This is a little more phonemic awareness. If this says vase, make it say vase, and you're moving one out, moving the out and moving the in. We talk a lot about making certain that a child does not attach a schwa to the or a teacher to the consonant. That makes it really hard to spell. It adds that extra sound. If this says Baz, make it say Baz, moving out the vowel. If this says Baz, make it say Blaz. and we're adding a consonant to the blend. The CTOP, if you are have the opportunity to really get the best assessment for phonological processing, Dr. Torgerson and his folks developed the CTOP. Everybody knows its worth. It just takes a little bit of time to do. But in those children that you suspect really are dyslexic, it will tell you about the rapid naming component, and it will tell you about the phonemic processing. I've just added these few things here. Jerome Rosner is one of the best for phonological processing in terms of giving teachers something to do with their children. So you might check that out. It is very helpful to have a chain of experiences to provide to your child who's sitting in front of you or the children in your group. So
that was just one element of the National Reading Panel we went through in depth, and here are the other elements. We knew we wouldn't have time to go through this, and certainly with our delay in the sound situation, we didn't get to cover as much as we would have liked. But the phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary from text, guided reading, comprehension strategies, and fluencies are all part of everyday reading groups. And these are just some key factors in programming for a child who is dyslexic. And for those of you who have to create your own rotation in the workshop model, this is just an example of what you might do in order to be able to serve all of your children. All right, so Sandra, we have 3 questions. What should one do when a child under 3 is having an articulation issue? 30 seconds on that.
I would, depending on how far under 3 it is, if it's a child who is 2 and it's a TH for S or an R, I would wait a little while. I would wait until age 3. And if the articulation remained a concern, then for certain, ask your speech-language pathologist or contact a speech-language pathologist, particularly if there are more than 1 or 2 sounds at that age.
Would a child looking for a word but retrieving a similar sounding word be an indicator?
Yes. That is often,
Classic.
it is classic. It's called an in-class, what's the word now? I can't retrieve the word, substitution. And it is, if that occurs more than really infrequently, I would definitely, that's again something that you might want to talk with a speech-language pathologist about, because depending on the age of the child, at the very young ages, your SLP is going to be the person that you need to be in contact with, but understand that not all SLPs understand the language to literacy continuum, and so you're going to need to question that yourself.
Okay, last question. Which parts of the brain are primarily affected around dyslexia?
Well, both. Because of the inefficiency in the way the brain processes both sound and language, because the retrieval is a part of it, and as is the phonemic development, then what you find in a dyslexic brain is a real scattered processing style, which, and by style I don't mean that they're choosing that, that's just the way that neurobiological difference manifests itself in that particular child. And so...
I think that covers it.
Okay.
And more questions, I guess, again. Talk With Me Baby is a broad project we have with the State Department of Public Health. Because your questions, children just need access to these 30,000 words a day, and if they aren't getting them from their parents, then they're going to be demonstrating a lack of expressive language. And again, that brain can look a lot like a dyslexic brain. If you've got specific questions, please don't hesitate to follow up with us.
No, and I didn't see one part of the question, that prefrontal cortex, working memory is also a component in dyslexia. Often it manifests itself as a part of an attention deficit disorder, a sort of profile in that prefrontal cortex.
Diane, I think we've got it 1 o'clock, so we will continue, but whatever you want us to do.
Fantastic. All I can say is, wow, thank you for so much thorough, great information. I didn't really realize how complicated dyslexia was either, and so I've learned a lot myself, and I hope others have as well. Would everybody join me in just quickly thanking our presenters? As you do that, I am going to stop the recording.